they mostly tell their stories in groups, in community settings, informally, yeah. But those hibakusha are the ones who, that's the majority. They will never tell their stories kind of, say, to the media or to, in a more formal way. But the ones who do decide to step forward in a formal way, often they'll be invited to the Hiroshima Peace Memorial Museum, which has an outreach department where archiving and dissemination, formal dissemination of these experiences takes place. Yes.
Yeah.
And
So, but did the survivors want to know what you were going to ask them in advance, or were you given
um it
completely
it
carte
was
blanche?
it was I was I was asked to I I was definitely vetted in a sense. Yes, I was vetted by them, I feel, um, sometimes in interview, and sometimes maybe by email, um, about what were my credentials. Yes. So, what were my credentials? Basically, they wanted to know that what I was doing was going to have an effect, that I wasn't just, in a way, say, a dark tourist, somebody who wanted to delve into, uh, you know, the most traumatic past that probably anyone has ever had, um, just because I had the possibility to do so, and that what I was going to do was going to be bona fide, that I was that I had track record as a researcher, and that also it would contribute in a very formal way to public discussion about their experiences,
And
which is
about peace, presumably, and about peace,
and
and
about
as
peace.
as being such a central thing in Hiroshima, isn't it? The concept of using memory to uh, further the cause of peace around the world, indeed.
Yeah, that's right. So so I think that one of the things that was very central to them was that was how the approach, and I had to train myself in how to approach them, because I didn't want to go there without and in a way, get myself into trouble by not being prepared. Yes, because it was a big deal to be let in to Hibakusha community. Yes, because you have to remember why also they might be reluctant to tell their stories, because basically what happened in 1945 is that, this is just in the case of Hiroshima. In the thesis, I don't have time to go into Nagasaki, and I didn't have time to research Nagasaki, but the overall circumstances are the same for Hibakusha, in both cities, which is that, in terms of Hiroshima, as a 16 kiloton bomb was dropped over the city 600 meters above central Hiroshima, and it exploded actually just above a hospital. When it happened, the military immediately censored. The military were not prepared to just give up at that point. And then after obviously Japan surrendered within 2 weeks, but then after that, 2 weeks later, when the islands were occupied, a new censorship was in place, and that new censorship was really universal. For 10 years after the bomb, pretty much there was no public discussion about what this bomb, the effects of this bomb, the radioactivity, the effects on the human body, and so on. And so the term hibakusha, which is now the official term for an atomic bomb survivor, didn't actually come in till 1957, 12 years after. So I realized that I wanted people who had a clear memory of what was life like before the bomb, what was life like growing up in Hiroshima in wartime, yes, but in a community, yeah, that was not an atomic bombed community. And I was looking for people who were who were in downtown Hiroshima, or who had come into Hiroshima. So many people had been evacuated. So many of the children had come in, but in the immediate aftermath to look for relatives.
Yeah.
So 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 I wasn't looking, there was no, in that sense, I didn't have a brief, I didn't have a particular experience I was looking for memory, people had who had been children. So that's a term also in Japanese, jakunen. The younger generation, the youth generation, are, are a specific cohort.
You sound recorded the interviews, presumably, did you?
I sound recorded, and I also videoed some of them, not all of
Yeah.
them.
And were the uh, witnesses able to see transcripts afterwards? Was that an
Yes.
important part of the
Oh,
deal?
yes. Yes, of course. Yeah, absolutely. They were
Uh,
able to see transcripts, and that was really important. Yeah.
and did they often want to change things or cut things out?
Um, no, it was mainly about, so basically I was transcribing, so I transcribed everything, and then I needed to check some translations and some meanings and so on. So I worked with them to refine that. Yeah, to refine the transcript.
Yeah. Were these interviews ever, I mean, seriously emotional, but both for both parties?
Yes. So that's really important. I think that, in terms of the approach, in terms of, I mean, I go into that a lot in the thesis, was, about my position in relation to the survivor, and how is it, you know, how does that develop as well? Because the core cohort, I did many interviews, but there's a core cohort that I feature in the thesis, and which I hope will be turned into a book now with the university press.
But did anybody break
Those
down
people.
during an interview? Did
Yeah. So I talk
that
about that.
happen?
Yeah, it happened in my first interview, actually. So that was quite good, because so the woman who'd invited me, and who then I interviewed her daughter and her granddaughter later. But when I first interviewed her, there was a moment towards the end, as we were getting to the end, she encountered a difficult memory, um, and one that she hadn't shared. I don't think she'd
And
really shared in public, because her daughter then told me she hadn't shared that in public, or
so
she
how
said,
did you handle that? How did you handle that,
well,
Liz?
we had to do it. So that's again, I explain in the thesis, but at that point, obviously we stopped the interview, and I at that point I was a bit worried that about how we would revisit, or continue the conversation, because it was a very emotional moment, and but she couldn't really go there, she couldn't really explain this. But we came back the next year, so I came back the next year, 6 months later, and we then did a different kind of interview. We did a walking interview, went to the site, we did different kind of, we just talked about different things. As you know, as some of your oral historians have said on this series, talk about, you change the subject. Yeah, so we talked about different things. We went back to the place of her childhood, where she had experienced running away from the bomb, back to her childhood home, and she actually ran into a fellow survivor, which was a really beautiful moment.
In what way?
And well, because we had them, so then they were chatting about very their very few remaining friends, who were still friends who from school, who were still alive. Only a very few of them, and those stories of the survivors that had made a good life. And so that we just left them chatting. But that then, and then, so really, I think it changed the way we related, me and her as well, because she had a good experience. And then we came back 6 months later again, or a few months later, and she then revisited that very difficult memory and explained why it had been so difficult for her.
But nonetheless was happy that it had been recorded, or you re-recorded.
Yes. Oh, yes.
Well, look, there's so much of interest in what you've been
Yeah,
saying, Elizabeth, and obviously you're still working through the outcomes to all this material that you've collected.
yeah,
Yes, you've had the PhD and you've talked there about the
yeah.
possibility of a book, but you've also been gradually working on a dramatic presentation of some of this material. Could you very quickly take us through the storyline of this drama that you're still developing?
Yeah. So I there was a curious thing, which is that I obviously had consent from my interviewees. I had formal consent for the interviews and also to make an archive of their interviews and to write up their interviews, possibly for publication. But at the same time, and perhaps it's just because of my own background, I had maybe the seed of an idea that this could make a very interesting and powerful drama. I didn't quite know at the time, but I gained consent from my cohort that I could, if possible, adapt also their interviews for a drama. Yeah. People find it very difficult to approach this subject. It's as I said, in Japan, not just here, but also in Japan, it's seen as a scary, sad, and painful subject. And there have been plays written, but mostly in the past, yes, there were some very good plays actually by Hisashi Inoue, who wrote The Face of Jizo, and Robert Lepage wrote Seven Streams of the River Otter. There have been dramatic presentations, but I really wanted to tell this as I wanted to tell this not necessarily as a as a verbatim story as such. So I didn't necessarily think that the quantity of stories that you could represent was important. I wanted to tell this vertically, yes. I wanted to tell this as a story that is in a family, partly because I had been given permission by my original survivor, who in a way was my gateway interviewee that I just discussed. She then introduced me to her daughter and granddaughter, and so I was in later years able to interview them. Um, and through interviewing them, I got a much more rounded sense of how the story plays out, not just for one generation, but over the generations. And in a way that made me realize that this is a story for young people. So I wanted to tell this as a story from the young person, from the granddaughter's point of view. Yes. So it's not. So it's not that by any means that we have done with the older generation. There's still so much to do, but as the Japanese have themselves have done, they've developed this ambassador program. They call it Denshosha. So this ambassador program where you can they kind of train young people in Hiroshima and Nagasaki to either interview their grandparents or simply to interview an elder, someone maybe they're not related to, but maybe in their community. And this is a very beautiful thing that is now producing new archives. Yes. So there are new online archives and formal archives. And but it's also, I think, partly, as you say, to continue this kind of culture of what they call a culture of peace, which is very unique to the two cities, um, which is the sort of hummingbird approach. So, which is that the more, bit by bit, yes, you tell the story bit by bit. So this is just one story of one family.
Yeah, I mean, and you mentioned it wasn't a verbatim approach, but what use of precise testimony is there within the script?
There is a lot of um, there is a lot of precise testimony because it's based on the transcripts. But I was given permission and I had to dramatize, yes, because that's how you hold an audience. Um, so it is the fact of this particular family, and but I've incorporated. Obviously, I've incorporated some other stories within that, yes. Um, but because because I got to know the family very well, they are, especially the granddaughter, has, in a way, it's her story. It really is her story. So it's not verbatim, but it's emotionally it's her story, because I've seen her grow up from aged 14 to now 29. So basically, the story is she's a teenager and she's at school, and she's given this challenge by her teacher, who says to her, we've got to do this, we're going to do this public speaking competition, and I want to enter you for it, but in order to enter you for it, I need to know that you're going to tell your family story. And she says, no way. Yeah, no way. I'm, I know, obviously I know my grandmother was in the bomb, but I don't want to go there. you know that's not, if I have to tell that story, yeah, I don't want that in my life. That's going to limit my life. Yes. And so it's about that block, that resistance, which is a very natural resistance of the subsequent generations to relating to this sad, painful, scary, and, as I would say, tragic story.